Right, well, good morning, everyone. We've heard some very interesting presentations this morning, covering various different areas which relate to what we as mining consultants do. One of the key elements to what we do is, of course, due diligence, which I'm going to talk to you about. But if I might take the liberty of summarising some of the things we heard about this morning, which are very key to us, is the thing about databasing projects. We have an analysis of what projects there are out there, what's going on, what stage are they at, where do we potentially fit into that, the potential or the possibility for zoning the world at large is an interesting one, and obviously we need to be aware where our clients are looking, how they're going to react to these changing circumstances. There are numerous activities involved in the whole process of mining. Due diligence is one. It's a good tie-in to the projects which are available, which are actually how do organisations make decisions whether or not they want to invest in. We've all done in due diligence ourselves in buying houses, buying cars, etc., etc. We all do it as a natural thing. But there's a structure to how it's done in our industry. So, before I go into too much about the DMT footprint, obviously we're represented in a number of different countries around the world, the majority of the continents we're in. We're also always looking to understand where we should be putting time, effort, money, personnel. The most recent one will be Astana, which will be in Q3 of this year. The rest, as you can see, are well established. Nottingham, Moscow, India, Indonesia, South Africa have been established now for a number of years. Each one has the options for drawing on resources of each of the other group member companies. What we refer to as knowledge investment, that's what we are, that's what we have. Investment is always talked about in financial terms as well, often understood. Mining companies put investment in terms of personnel, manpower, experience, expertise. From our perspective, it's what we know. As consultants, our people have had numerous experiences around the world, and we bring this together to formulate whatever we need to do, whether it's 43101, a JORC report, it's a resource or reserve statement, it's going to be a mineral experts report, competent persons report, plus all other acronyms which are out there. And the various elements which we do are technical due diligence, as we put quite a high profile on this because it's good for us to understand exactly what's going on in the project, to be able to summarize it to a point where decisions can be made on potential investment in future. Due diligence process on behalf of investors, of course, is a key element to it. Lenders technical engineer is something which I personally am involved in directly, have been now for about 10 years on two fairly large-scale projects, and there's a couple of slides later on which give you some information on that as to what it actually means. Site visit team composition, obviously we have regional hubs, as I mentioned earlier. We have a number of different companies in different locations around the world. Within the framework of that, we have different expertise in those hubs, different companies, and we can call upon that at any time to assemble teams, and it works from their perspective too. If they need input from our side, then they can call us to do it. So some of the assumptions which have been made about due diligence process. Obviously, when we're doing due diligence, there has to be a very clear scope of work which has been defined by our client as exactly what they want us to do. Commonly these days we're asked to comment on it and add to it if we think something is missing or there is a new trend or preference which is perhaps to their advantage to be looked into. Changes of scope, obviously there's an effect on the timeline and cost. We're obviously keen to do the job as quickly as possible within the time frame we're given, but it's got to be done accurately. And there are a number of times when due diligence takes a lot longer than was anticipated because there is always a possibility of doing things like a gap analysis to find something that's missing, in which case you need to do more work. Site-based personnel have been informed, i.e. the company that's being looked at, whether it's a brownfield site, if it's a greenfield site, it's slightly different, but there's usually somebody there from the client's perspective or the entity which is being looked into, which are on the ground. It's important that they're aware of what we, as the consultants, are actually being expected to do. Data information obviously provided in English, we assume that. There are some of us who have some language skills in different languages, but by and large, English is the preferred language. The impacted parties, including the surrounding communities, this is really important. Environmental, social, and governance now is very high profile. Corporate social responsibility is a key element. The impact of the project has to be understood, and therefore making sure that all local entities are embraced within the framework of how its projects will be put together is a key element of it. Permits and licenses are in place, obviously. We've had some experiences recently where permitting has taken years, and it really does have some detrimental impact. Hopefully, in most cases, it's resolved relatively expediently, and that the permits are given in a good time, and the project can start. That's the key. Marketing information, i.e. the prices which have been used and the potential sales of offtake agreements, etc., are reasonable. Obviously, that's a key part of it, because if you can't sell it, there's not much of a project there. Political and social issues, well, politics is a different business. There's numerous different activities going on all the time around a project. Governments change, municipalities change, people's thoughts, preferences change. Information now in the technical age is so much information available on the handheld cell phones these days that you can research anything within minutes of somebody making a comment about it. Specific certificates, this could be conflict minerals, for example. We've all heard about blood diamonds. There are other blood categories which you won't go into too much, but you have to be sensitive towards these because there are ramifications for company investment, particularly high-level organizations. Banks, for example, are very keen that there's no dirty business going on. And any missing or contradictory information, obviously, that needs to be identified, and that we do through gap analysis, which is a standard process. This is not rocket science, but it's a process for identifying where things have been missed and what needs to be done to correct it. Therefore, the full due diligence process can take place, and the full information is therefore available. So the objectives is assessing of what data is there, reading through it, making sure you understand it. If there's any issues about it or things which are missing, that's identified. Additional activities which may need to be done by the client or by the entity involved, being the subject of the due diligence, is important because it can obviously take time. There is obviously a cost impact in that too. The site assessment, site visit, is obviously, as I mentioned before, key that we look into everything around the project to understand what it is, technically, but also socially and also environmentally. Key elements, particularly with funding agencies, particularly the larger banks. We're looking at the mining, processing, infrastructure risks. These are obviously important elements to it. It's identifying by virtue of a risk assessment, which we would bring into part within the framework of the due diligence itself, and assessment of the organization and financial structure of the company. Deliverables, I mentioned already gap analysis. This is a formal document which is prepared to us at the very outset under data review, submitted to the client with recommendations of what needs to be done to put the gaps right. And then we have conflict source certification, which is obviously relating to what I mentioned before, which relates to issues of where the product or products may have come from, and is there any bad elements to this which needs to be identified, some clarity on that. And then, of course, there's the draft report itself of due diligence, which goes through to the client with all of our assessments on it. There's discussions which take place. And ultimately, there's a final report once all of the discussions have been completed, the activities have been identified, may have been done or addressed, or put on as an annex to the report on with a caveat that they could be, or they may be necessary to be completed before the final decision can be made. The main game of this, or the main aim, is to get to what's referred to as financial close in terms of a bank or, from a mining company perspective, the actual decision to continue or not. Key questions, and I've put these under banners of technical, administration, environmental and social, obviously key elements to what's going on. Is the resource viable? Identify geological risks. The issue is in terms of mineral cycle, where are you on the mineral cycle, obviously, and if you're starting a project up and the mineral price structure is going upwards, the likelihood is over a 3 or 4 or 5 year construction period, the price could be coming down. That isn't necessarily ideal. Difficult to interface these two things, but it's an important part of due diligence to understand where you are. This relates also to the marketing side as to the reality, is it reasonable, the prices which have been suggested in terms of cost price, but also the sales price. Is the process tried and trusted? New techniques or new novel techniques is never really looked into positively by financing companies because there's risks, huge risks with it. If it's not tried and tested, it's something which they wouldn't necessarily go into. It could be a very narrow opportunity. The logistics and infrastructure issues obviously is important. The more remote the site is, the more difficult it is to get in and out. And that covers numerous things, including manpower, personnel, safety on site, various different elements of the whole process of understanding where you are, what you do, how you do it, how you get it out at the end. Administration side is site conditions. That's relating to the personnel site conditions. Is it a particularly warm area, particularly huge differentiation in temperature, for example? Summer is very hot, winter is extremely cold. All this has a bearing on what the impact of the actual construction of the process plant, for example, but also on the conditions for the personnel. Hostile situations, including the sourcing well, a lot of mines are in difficult areas. Very few mines are by the sea with a nice port and a decent hotel accommodation around. It just doesn't work that way. It's usually in the jungle or the middle of a desert somewhere, or very isolated in the mountain ranges. I've experienced all of them myself. What are local regulations regarding labour? It's important to understand and then make sure that recruitment of any local parties or people is done to the optimum level. But they obviously have to be of the right type of background and skill levels to ensure that you get benefit out of that. But there's a requirement to ensure that local communities are involved, engaged in the project, and labour recruitment is part of that. Environmental, social. Consultation processes are really important, as we all know, and it's important that everybody is involved, has a voice. Any processes are there in place to make sure that any grievances are reported at the earliest opportunity, and that the interaction between the company and the local population is clear from the outset, and that all consultations which could be done have been done, and if not, when are they going to be done? Fringe industries, this is also an important element of it, is to what else can be done once the process for developing the mine takes place and the rehabilitation starts. What else can be done to generate other tangential, small-scale industries which could benefit the local population with something which they have expertise in? Could be rehabilitation by planting trees which bear fruit or nuts or something like that, creates a small additional economy. And one of the big questions, of course, now with CSR is how far does it go into the community? Obviously, CSR, we all understand, has various different forms. Depending on where you are, it has different levels of expectation. The data mining process. So the initial part of processes for data review is where we're looking at the documentation. We're looking at, obviously, the bankable feasibility study or the definitive feasibility study, the ESIA documentation, to make sure that it's all clear and that the two relate to each other, and that everything has been covered, which we would expect to be covered. Any issues, we'd obviously point that out as part of the gap analysis. Missing data, what to do about it, as I mentioned before. And the economic and financial data, how pertinent it is, how old it is, essentially what that means. Is if something was done 5 years ago, how relevant is it to now? We heard about that in earlier presentations, to making sure the data was up to date. And if not, then how soon will it be regenerated? Excuse me. And the site visit is understand the location and the topography. Obviously, where the site is on a map on Google is one thing. Physically going there and standing in it or around it or where it's going to be is a whole different ballgame. You need to really understand what that is and what does that mean in terms of relating to logistics, moving people in, moving out, but also moving materials in and out, supply routes, etc. Infrastructure challenges, these are relating to routes in and out, road, rail, air, where possible, if it's relevant. Potential risks and mitigations. As I mentioned earlier, the risk assessment is done to understand exactly what's going on, what are the risks, and to make sure that the report summarizes what these may be so that the full information where we perceive risks and what the mitigation should be is understood and can be presented to the client. And finally, the capacity capability of the client's organization is a key element. It's a very important part of it. It's important that the people who are on the ground physically charged to develop the mine, construct the project into an operation, one, have the capacity, capability to do it, have the background to do it, the understanding, the need to make sure everything's done as correctly as possible. That's quite a high level assessment, but you get a picture when you meet people what the capabilities are. The reports, gap analysis I mentioned before, risk assessment, and then prepare and present the final report. The activities covered, well, obviously, from the point of view of a mine, it's going to be geology, mining, and processing. From the administration side, you've got organization, marketing. Most importantly, keep CapEx and OpEx assessment to make sure that the pricing which has been used to develop NPV, IRR are reasonable. That's an incredibly difficult thing to assess, but we have obviously databases of information we use, and obviously we have backgrounds of information which we've used from other projects, and other information which of course is used or available off the internet. Excuse me. Environmental and social, another acronym. ESHIA, or let's have a look at IFC performance standards and equator principles, very, very high profile issues relating to the international commercial banks in particular, but development banks easily also want to know what the situation is there. This is not new, but it's an important facet and must be understood, and what needs to be done with it to actually implement it. Innovative mineral cycle and the project. This is all about relating one curve, the production or the construction curve of a plant, the S-curve, relation to the mining situation with regard to the mineral. Where are you on the actual price cycle? All minerals have got various cycles. In the last, say, 10 years, it's changed radically. There's been some very volatile things going on in, say, for example, the iron ore industry, which has never been like that. Historically, was relatively flat, and now it's almost as volatile as gold. It's a crazy situation. And responsible sourcing, obviously, in relation to making sure that you're buying products and the final product coming out has got a good audit to understand where it came from, particularly relating to these things like the blood diamonds kind of issue. Just interestingly, due diligence is one process, but the mining codes themselves have also moved in a similar direction in terms of what they actually do. Rather than just looking at the mining side, they're looking at processing, they're looking at infrastructure and organization. So there's a close similarity between these two activities. So when you're looking at a JORC report, 43101, you're getting a lot more information about it. And that's obviously part of what we're looking at too, as well with respect to particular projects. Some overlays just to reinforce what I was saying earlier. This is iron ore pricing going from 2009 to 2019. The last 10 years, you can see the wild fluctuations, huge change. Now, I might add that we're going back through another cycle, which is a significant increase in the iron ore spot prices up to well over $110. Only a matter of 2 years ago, it was down to about 27. It's a huge change. The bottom diagram shows basically implementation with the S-curve. So that's the actual project itself over a period of 2010 to 2015. That's what implementation phase. What does that mean? Well, this is an actual project. So it started there in 2010, and it was actually finished in 2015. So the big spike was missed. However, the next spike, they're ready for. So it's all about, again, as I said, the actual processes, understanding where the cycles are. So what's the point? Well, nobody's going to invest to stand still or lose money. This is not going to happen. Investment is made towards intelligence, i.e. due diligence. Mineral price cycle is an important element to this whole process. Recognition of the new technology is important because there are new advents going on all the time. We are also aware of new processes which can affect particular minerals, particular areas, particular zones, or particular interest to our clients. Price upturn isn't necessarily the basis for investment, it's because that's too late. The gambit of choosing where to invest and how much to invest is based on what? Well, it's due diligence. That's the whole point of this exercise. And what goes up must come down. Sadly, that's the truth. All mining cycles are up. There's a cycle because it goes up and it goes down. And then there are no sure things, but there are obviously windfalls now and again where things suddenly change. And you could say the same with that on the iron ore because it went crazy in 2010, 2011, 2012. And it's going that same way in 2019. So interesting, but of course it's all about the other activities going on in the industry which affect the prices. So these are some just very brief guidelines to you. These are actual projects. This is just in a flavor of to show what activities actually there are. The project manager is in fact me. in this project. The first top one there is the due diligence process, so it shows the activities breakdown of the various work which has taken place. The next part is ILE monitoring, which is monitoring for lenders, and you can see the various inputs and various people. This is based on time. So my point here is that the project manager itself is a key part of the project to make sure that everything's coordinated properly through due diligence, right into then, I'm over to monitoring. Can I keep going? Shut up, you mean? Okay. Okay, innovation involves hours. That's within DMT. DMT is an engineering organization. We have a number of different elements, assets, which we develop. Yours, which are out in the industry there, you as players in the industry itself, you have new things coming on all the time, which is companies doing something new. There are other things going on. We're all aware of that. And what we try and do is to embrace both ours and theirs in the whole process of due diligence. I can stop there. Okay, thank you very much.